Color grading is about creating consistency, it's about creating neutrality, and then at the final stages it's about pushing in that look across the film. This course is designed to show you how you can build those things in camera, so you can give yourself that neutrality right from the outset, rather than having to push and pull your signal around to create, you know, whites and grays and blacks before you then have to actually start pushing in looks further on. Everything about the way a camera works is informed by the way that the eye works. All of the biology and science and the study of the human visual system that has taken place over 120, 130 years has allowed us to develop cameras that mimic the way we see, from the sampling system of RGB to the way that you extrapolate complementary colors from known red, green, blue signal. Everything about that is born out of the study of the human visual system. So simple things like our perception of green and the dominance that we have towards that color perception in that area of hue, that's replicated in cameras. There are twice as many green photosites covered by the Bayer filter, the color filter array, which sits on top of all camera sensors. There are twice as many green receptors as there are red and blue. There are all kinds of things that are mimicked by cameras that work towards the way our eye works, but then there are fundamental differences as well. So for example, camera sensors are natively linear. They record light linearly, whereas our eyes don't work that way. Our eyes perceive the world in a more logarithmic fashion, so we have more sensitivity in shadows and midtone areas, and we see more detail in those areas, and we see a lot less detail in highlights, for example. So to mimic the way that our eye perceives the world around us, cameras can have power functions or transforms or gammas that can be applied to them, which will help mimic that response to tonal range that our eyes have. And log is one of those kind of buzzwords that's been around for a few years now, but it's also kind of a potentially tricky thing to work with. Essentially what you're doing when you're shooting in log is you're telling your camera to shift where it's assigning its tonal range across the image. Now that allows you to mimic more closely what the eye does, so it allows us to bring up more detail in shadow areas and reassign those steps of tonal range to areas where they're more useful to us and at the expense of areas where they're not so useful. So basically the upper kind of highlight range is really kind of crammed in. Now, at the same time, what it's trying to do is it's trying to squeeze greater dynamic range in as well, which of course also mimics the way the eye works. I can quite comfortably see detail inside this room and outside the window, whereas the camera will struggle because its dynamic range is not as great as the eye. But to help get closer to it, that's again where log can be used to compress the dynamic range into a smaller container, which you can then later on in post pull back out again. That's all well and good. However, if you're trying to shoot, let's say, S-Log3 in an A7S II, a camera which is 8 bits, 420, and yet it's got the most kind of aggressive compression that, you know, in terms of a log curve that Sony produce, that's quite a dangerous combination, because you're actually squeezing and compressing the image to maximize its dynamic range, but then encapsulating that into a codec, which by its very nature is missing an awful lot of the data that would have originally been received by the sensor. A lot of that's gone by that point, and you're then trying to pull that back out again, and the image can start to degrade. You can have issues with noise, of course. So having a good concept and a good understanding of which gammas are most appropriate for the camera you're using and the situation you're using can go a long way into making sure that you've got a good, clean digital negative to work with later on. If you're using a higher caliber camera, so if you're spending a lot more on a camera, the post-processing and the codec that they're recording to is so much greater, and often the bit depth of the video signal is so much greater, that these things just look much better. They can handle that pushing and pulling to a much greater extent. They're also cleaner, they have a lower noise floor, so you can fall into the trap of hearing people saying, yeah, always shoot log, that's the best thing, but maybe they're using, a Amiras or Alexas or Reds or cameras which actually have the capability of recording that in so much greater detail than you might be able to achieve with the camera that you're using. So thinking about the camera that you've got and thinking about the scene that you're presenting it with. So for example, log is designed to compress greater dynamic range. Well, there'd be no point therefore using that if you're pointing your camera a low dynamic range scene. And I see that done an awful lot. There were plenty of times, for example, in our commercial where I was pointing it at quite flat scenery. There wasn't that dynamic range that would necessarily call for a log curve to be used. There's nothing wrong with flicking to different gamma profiles for the appropriate shot, particularly if you're the one that's responsible for editing and grading that stuff together come the end. You're going to have to grade it anyway, because you would have to with log anyway. So that work is still going to be necessary. What helps then is understanding how to match those shots and create continuity across shots, and that's really color grading skills. But helping yourself by choosing appropriate profiles and thinking about how you can maximize the image signal that you've got in the particular camera you've got, and making sure that if you're pointing your camera at a very high dynamic range scene, then using the appropriate gamma, or if you're pointing it at a low dynamic range scene, then using the appropriate gamma. That's going to give you the best quality image that you can work with later on in post. One of the key things you need to get right, first of all, is the very basic white point, the white balance of the image. A lot of people would assume, because we have sunlight just streaming in here, it must be 5,500 Kelvin, preset the camera to that, dial that into lights. The average color temperature is going to change, obviously, depending on the time of year, time of day, and geographically whereabouts you are on the planet. So rather than just assuming and guessing what the color temperature is, you need to measure it. A simple showing of this card where your subject is to the camera, one button press of a manual white balance, and everything will slot into place. Every single color will slot exactly where it should be. It's been designed to be completely pigment-free. So as the light comes in from outside and hits this, all of the frequencies that are hitting it are being reflected back. So if I white balance from this source, I'm going to have a very accurate neutral starting point for my camera. So I'm just going to grab this and I'm just going to stick it on a chair for now. And you can see the sun is just catching it there. Kieran, if you step to the side, get your shadow off there. I grab my camera, I'm simply going to take a manual white balance. Every camera has a manual white balance option on there, so those two little triangles lying on their side. It's just a case of setting that and taking a sample from it. So I've got two presets I can set, which is useful if I'm going from inside to outside or moving from one artificial light source to another. I can set those two presets and shift between them nice and quickly. I'm just going to set this one up for our daylight interior that we're mainly natural lighting for this. If I point this at the target, manually white balance from that. Because you're manually sampling the light sources around you, it will show you on screen what the white point that it comes up with is, and you then have a value that you can plumb into your tunable LEDs if that's what you're using. And once my camera has told me what the color temperature is, let's say that we're getting 5,800 in the room right now, I can dial that straight into my tunable LEDs, and I now know that we're all consistent. So even the artificial light sources are falling exactly into the right color temperature rather than drifting off in different areas. As a final step though, just to make sure that anything that I record is as balanced as possible, I'm actually going to use the reverse side of this chart, particularly the color chips here, which are going to give me a saturated reference for my primaries and secondary colors. I'm just going to turn this around, set this up on here as well, and I'm just going to film a few seconds of that. We have the exposure bars in the middle, the top one being a 90% reflectance, and that's kind of standard issue white reference point for judging exposure. So you can plot that against 90 IRE if you're shooting in a standard Rec 7 gamma. If you're shooting in log, each one will have a different value. So, and you can find this out from the manufacturer's website. So we're shooting S-Log 2 right now. This 90% reflectance value therefore should fall at 59% IRE based on Sony's own white paper. Certain cameras, it is advised to slightly push that higher to clean up certain problems in the shadows, but nonetheless, purely based on the numbers alone, and according to Sony's own white paper on this, you should find that 90% reflectance falls at 59% for S-Log2, it's 61% for S-Log3, basically essentially 60%, and that's where the highlights are being compressed. So if you're shooting into standard Rec 709, it's completely easy. 90 becomes 90, really straightforward. You can use the waveform monitor, you can use zebras, you can use your histogram if you've got a reference on there. It's pretty straightforward. But using these charts in camera to help with exposure really aids consistency across multiple cameras. And if you just record a few seconds, you've then got that imprinted, and that's coming with you down the pipeline into post-production, where you can then use this, and I'll show you the technique to be guaranteeing that all of your cameras match all of the colors that they're seeing, particularly using the saturated primary and secondary colors here. You can use that lined up on the vector scope in Resolve or whatever program you use to guarantee that your image is 100% accurate. And it's so good that it'll actually even iron out any discrepancies between the basic color science of the camera that you're using.
Okay, so I'm just going to launch DaVinci Resolve. This is the software that I use to do this process, but you can actually do this with the tools that are built into Final Cut Pro 10.4 and with tools like Color Finale. There's a variety of plugins that will allow you to do this. But the first thing I need to do is I need to make sure that my exposure is accurate, and I can do that by drawing a quick power window just around the exposure guidance chips that are on the front of the chart. And by drawing a mask around them, it helps isolate them in the waveform monitor, and I can then clearly place them. So I'm just going to put black down just above 0, and I'm going to put white just up underneath 896 code value. Now that equates to roughly 90 IRE, and then I'm just going to shift the gamma down just to redistribute the 20 IRE and the 40 IRE grey chips. And that's a very rough step, but that gets me basically with my exposure correct. I then move the mask across to the saturated primaries and secondary chips, just re-jiggle the mask so that they are nice and clearly defined. But the waveform's no use to me here. What I need to do is move across to my vector scope. I've just pushed in a little bit of saturation across the board to help me get started, but the real work happens in the hue versus hue and the hue versus sat controls. So the first thing I do is click on the preset secondary and primary color buttons that are along the bottom of the hue versus hue curve. And by adding those control points and moving them up and down, I can either move my reference points clockwise or anti-clockwise around the vector scope. And you can see all I'm doing here is just making sure they're pointing at the boxes that are shown in the vector scope when you're at 2x zoom. I can then go into my hue versus sat controls, and if I move these up, then I'm adding saturation to that control point. If I move them down, I'm pulling out saturation from that control point. And so by using hue versus hue to align the hues where they should be pointing, and then the hue versus sat curve to actually make the ends of those traces fall within those boxes. If you do a manual white balance in camera, you'll find it should be pretty close. How far off it starts off is down to the level of compression that's within your signal, how much color data was there in the first place, the individual color science of the camera you were using and how it post-processes the raw data off the sensor, which is very different from camera to camera. It also has a lot to do with the quality of your lighting sources in the environment that you were shooting in, your gamma curve. So for example, when you're shooting log, it will obviously desaturate the image, and that has a big knock-on effect on how much color data is left behind for you to manipulate. But if you can push those hue versus hue controls so that the hues at least line up correctly, that's 90% of the battle won. Your image then should look accurate in terms of color. If you can take the additional step of pushing saturation into the colors where it needs it, then that will also give you the vibrancy that you need. But if your signal can't take that, and a good indicator of whether or not it can or can't take that level of pushing is if the traces on the vector scope start to kind of go a bit thin and spidery. That's kind of a warning that you are losing data, you're losing headroom really. these values are based on Rec 709, they're standard primary and secondary values. They're completely universal across all HD video signals. And so by matching these points up, you are guaranteeing you're in good shape. So if I do this exact same step on multiple cameras, then you can actually very quickly get close to matching all the cameras. So it's a very quick process. Really probably only takes about 2 or 3 minutes per chart shot that you've got, and you should be generating these chart shots at the beginning of each new setup or scene, or if there's a considerable change in lighting, it might be worth doing it again. But you can see here, I'm basically done. Everything's falling where it should do. And if I remove the mask, once I'm done, the corrections that I'm applying will then apply to the entire image, and everything will just slot into place perfectly.
These are technical considerations. These are things that, as a colorist, you're expected to know. And the colorist's role is kind of an interesting one because they're incredibly technical. They have to have a deep understanding of the science behind the way that images are produced, captured, recorded, compressed, because it helps them do their job. For example, one of the things that a colorist would be incredibly mindful of is how much color information is still left in the signal by the time they've got it. A lot of cameras that you may well own, you may not even realize, are throwing away vast amounts of color information whilst they're recording those images. A process known as chroma subsampling, for example, will chuck away either 50% or 75% of the color information that the sensor is actually capable of recording in order to compress it into a lightweight codec for working with further down. It also enables the camera to write to cheaper media, slower media like SD cards. So chroma subsampling is a really good example of where, admittedly incredibly clever algorithms are used to average out color information, replace color information, chuck away color information. Spatial compression will do the same. So these things have an impact on the digital negative. They have a big impact on what you can and can't do later on in post. And the cheaper your camera, the more likely it is that it will be doing these things. And so the more important it is that you're making sure that you're getting things as close to perfect in camera as possible, so you've got that wiggle room later on to tease out any particular colors or contrasts that you think will aid your narrative. 3 key things there. Calibrating our monitors, making sure that what we see is what we get. Using a grey card to make sure that the white point in camera is set precisely based on the ambient white point in the room that you're in or in the environment that you're in. And using tools like this to make sure that exposure is consistent and accurate, and recording a few seconds of this to make sure that we can check skin tones or color references on a vector scope. They're simple things. No one of those 3 things is going to take you more than 10, 20 seconds. But each one of them, and particularly all of them, is going to guarantee that you're getting a really high quality, neutral starting point, ready to then push further if you need to, or manipulate in the color grade to get those colors going where you want them to go. And of course, any colors that you've built into the production that are there on screen are also going to naturally appear vibrant and clear and clean and accurate. And once you start doing it, you quickly realize, how did I ever not do this in my productions before? So investing in a good chart is a really good step towards clean color management and consistency of color across all of your shots.